Listen, you smell something?
Human emotions are materializing in the form of a viscous psychoreactive plasm with explosive supernormal potential.
What a discovery, a psychoreactive substance.
Do you know what this equipment is used for?
Boggle or Super Mario Brothers?
We'll have fun!
Yeah! They're still doing it. Really quite good work there.
My friend, don't be a jerk.
We've got no choice. Call the Ghostbusters.
Super Jackpot!
Welcome to Extraplasm Podcast. It's the only podcast on the internet that's blaming fate, luck, or karma for its difficulties in keeping a regular weekly schedule, despite not actually believing that everything happens for a reason. I'm your host, Jim Maritato, aka Vink Maniac on the internet, and I'm happy to be back bringing you another episode of Extraplasm, or perhaps more aptly put this week, an updated episode of Extraplasm. As things have been a bit crazed here and scheduling time has been complicated given family and life circumstances I've told you about in recent weeks, we're engaging in a bit of a remaster and update project this week. For those of you who are longtime listeners of the show, you may remember an episode that told the history of Engine Company 23, or Fire Station 23, the dilapidated firehouse in Los Angeles' Skid Row that we better know as the interior of the Ghostbusters Firehouse. This was an episode I did alone early in the show's run before regularly weekly spots were necessarily nailed down with guests, but it was also one that led to a lot of praise from content creators, historians, and fans in the community. So I kind of wanted to revisit it. I wanted to go back and take a look at this episode because it's been almost 2 years since it was released, and you're probably asking, well, why? Well, first, I wanted to bring you an update to the Firehouse's story, as there's some new developments that have taken place in the last 18 months that really make it worthwhile to talk about Engine 23 again. And second, I know that many people who've come into the show's listenership in the lead up to Frozen Empire may have just never heard this episode given how early it was in the show's run, and this is one of those rare instances where you'll actually hear me say that I was proud of the level of research and analysis I did in preparing the episode, not because I don't always do a lot of prep work, but I mean, to be frank, the prep work for a history episode is a lot different than the prep work to talk about what happened this past week or to talk with my contemporaries and friends about what they have going on or what cool toys are coming out, etc. So episode 10 also speculated a bit about the future of the Firehouse, and to be frank, some of my speculation was right, and in some ways it was wrong, so it bears correcting or fixing those things that are incorrect. And finally, episode 10 exists in a time before I was gifted a better microphone by a very old and good friend, before I had 2 years of self-taught audio engineering under my belt, and thus, while I was always proud of the content, the episode definitely could have sounded better. So, what we're doing this week is a remastering and an update, an improvement upon the original, and then some new content to continue Engine 23's story. So, is this entirely a new episode? Well, no, but is there new content here? For sure. And for course, we're going to still kick things off with some Ghostbusters headlines from the last couple of weeks. But I also want to give you an idea of where things are headed in terms of Extraplasm's regular production schedule. As you've likely determined from my discussion in the last episode and the somewhat irregular podcast release schedule in the last couple of weeks, I am at a point where I need to dial down how much content I'm trying to produce in the time frame I'm trying to produce it, at least temporarily. Toward that end, after this episode comes out, there's going to be a break in Extraplasm episodes until the Wednesday of the first week of September, so right after Labor Day, I guess that is. And after that point, the goal is going to be to take the show bi-weekly instead of weekly through September and October. If time affords it, I may try to surprise you with 3 weeks of content out of 4 in a given month, but for now, I'm going to try to commit to bi-weekly shows as I anticipate needing to travel back and forth between the East Coast and West Coast over the next 8 weeks or so to be with my family at different times. And then we'll revisit where things are when we reach November and how things are going. I know for some of you, this really won't matter because you enjoy Extraplasm when you find time to do so, and, thus having your weekly fix is less important than having 5 episodes to binge at once and then send me messages about all the things that you heard about that you thought were great, and I love getting those, so keep them coming. But I also know that for some of you, having your podcast each week is part of your routine or part of what helps you to feel like you're connected to a community. I mean, I won't lie, many of you know that part of the reason that Extraplasm started is because The Crossrip, a podcast that I still love, and Troy and Chris over there are fantastic people. I started Extraplasm because of their decisions to sort of figure out how to prioritize life around podcasts. And at the time, I wanted to make sure that things stayed weekly. And it's one of the things that I've been so committed to it as long as I have been, because I understood what it was like to kind of have that relationship with a podcast each week that keeps you, sort of in tune with your fandom and the community of people that you like who are in it. But then to have it sort of change its schedule and have it go and do a different thing and have a different, set of priorities because of its own relationships and the relationships of the people in it. And so I want you to understand that this doesn't mean like the podcast is going away. But, I also know that for some of you, that this is part of your routine. It's part of what helps you to feel like you're connected to your community. So regardless of what camp you fit in, I hope you'll be patient as I make this necessary adjustment to create a better balance between podcasting and fandom and home and work and family commitments and all of the things that are happening here. Producing Extraplasm always requires a bit of adaptation and planning because we have different guests each week. And I mean, even in my own home context, there's always something going on that has to be worked around. In the case of this weekend, when I thought I'd be able to get an episode out, it was the fact that my neighbors were doing something right outside of our windows that was pretty loud for most of the weekend and that would have disrupted and gave you a pretty poor quality episode. So, like I say, though, there's always some sort of level of adaptation going on, whether it's the audio context of the guest who's coming in or planning and setting those things up with different guests who we interview each week. And Extraplasm rotates who comes on, every single week, such that it's not the same people coming in with the same context that we can replicate and know exactly how it's going to work. So I'm used to that. I'm used to making those changes and sort of jumping in and, figuring out how do we adapt to the dynamics of different folks coming in and different content that's happening each week, but balancing all of that and sort of juggling that alongside the pretty, harrowing things that are going on in terms of my mother's care and things that are happening in family life and work life is pretty difficult. So we're going to make the necessary adjustments we need to. We're going to do the bi-weekly thing in September and October with maybe a bonus episode in there. We're going to figure out at some point where we're going to celebrate the fact that we've had 2 years of podcasting, because I do think it's something we should still sort of stop and, smell the roses about. It's kind of a cool thing that's happened to be able to have 2 full years of this, and we're approaching 100 episodes of Extraplasm, which is very cool, but it's going to happen in a more balanced and paced out way. And I hope that is not a long-winded explanation and overly emo take on what's going on here, because I feel like I've been a little too open in the last few weeks. But with those logistics expressed and some expectations defined for what the immediate future looks like, let's get into some Ghostbusters headlines.
Still making headlines all across the country, the Ghostbusters are at it again.
Today, the entire eastern seaboard is alive with talk of incidents of paranormal activity.
Call-in topic today, ghosts and ghost busting.
Extraplasm, read all about it. Ghostbusters headlines coming at ya.
In official Ghostbusters media news, Ghostbusters Frozen Empire continues to succeed on digital, with the Nielsen Company reporting that the movie earned recognition as both the top movie and the top streaming content overall for the week ending July 28th. I'll keep saying this until we have it. The success of Frozen Empire on digital and streaming platforms should be a key indicator to Sony that a live-action series on a service like Netflix could do very well and draw in many viewers who are currently casual fans, but who might not otherwise seek out a box office release. And if we learned anything from shows like Stranger Things, that means merchandise, more theme park tickets, etc., money. Who wants to make that? Everybody. To me, this is just more evidence that Ghostbusters belongs as a recurring storytelling universe on digital platforms. We know we're going to get to see an animated series on Netflix, and I'm totally stoked about that. But I would really love to see a live action series be the thing that follows a cartoon show, and to see Sony do with Ghostbusters what Paramount has done right with Star Trek, despite having financial woes when doing a lot else. But for real, I really think that it would be nice for us to be able to recognize how great, Frozen Empire is doing on digital and how much it's resonating with people who would otherwise not necessarily go out to see a movie. And I think this is something to start to, grapple with. In a post-COVID world where many people learn to stay home and watch movies even harder than they were before, there's a rationale, you have to go to a movie and actually go see it. I'm not going to lie to you. There were several movies I said I was going to go see in the last few weeks that I didn't go see because there were other priorities in my life. I actually wanted to go see Twisters and like 4DX and go sit in a weird seat and laugh about it, but I just didn't get the time because of everything going on. At the same time, when Twisters shows up on Netflix, I'm absolutely going to sit down and watch it because I can do so at 3 o'clock in the morning and enjoy it regardless of what else is going on, and while being a crazed insomniac who just kind of never sleeps. Which, I don't know. I can't go to the movies at 3 o'clock in the morning. Maybe that's a thing somebody should figure out at the theater. Maybe they shouldn't, because there would be weird things that happen in the movie theaters. I digress. But the point is that I really want to see more digital content for Ghostbusters. I've said this over the last few months. I've talked about it with Jason Fitzsimmons, etc., where I think that, looking at how well Frozen Empire is doing on streaming, whereas folks kind of looked at its box office take as good enough, but kind of lukewarm with respect to how much it cost, is kind of a thing that, really wrap our heads around. Can we get more Ghostbusters out of digital maybe than we can just by relying on box office alone? So I don't know. We'll see what happens. It'll be interesting to see what happens with the animated series, but I'm really thrilled to see Ghostbusters Frozen Empire continuing to succeed so much on digital. One other official Ghostbusters headline, or at least I'm going to call it that because I don't think you get much more official than the original props from the original movies. The prop store auction happened since we last talked, and I actually had a chance to go check out the preview of the auction in person at the Peterson Museum in Los Angeles, along with friends of the show J.D. Raymer, Lawrence Duane, and recurring Extraplasm guest Miguel Medina of the LA Ghostbusters. And among the items up for auction was the only surviving Slimer suit that Steve Johnson made for the original Ghostbusters that you may have heard Steve and I talk about a few weeks ago. This was a drinking variant of Slimer that was unused in the movie and that was sympathetically restored by Aryan Tuaten's studio during the building of the suits for Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. And I have to say, it was stunning to see this in person and astonishingly small for a performer to fit in. When you look at Kevin Mangold in the Frozen Empire Slimer costume, Kevin's a pretty small guy. He's not particularly tall. And Kevin, if you're listening while you're running, as I know you do, none of that is said in judgment. But it is said in comparison to Mark Brian Wilson, who has been taller, wider, and thicker than Kevin his entire life, and who would have been the person that suit was sculpted around, and based off Steve's explanation, and who ultimately wore that rendition of the same body cast when he performed as Slimer. As Steve explained to us on Extraplasm, they used the same body for all of the Slimers that they made and then changed the mouth with a different prosthesis. So imagining Mark inside this tiny suit renders a much more cramped and challenging context for him to perform in, within at least my mind at least, but maybe we'll get to ask Mark about that sometime soon. Who knows? But in the meantime, it was really cool to see the only surviving Slimer costume from the original film, and to whoever spent the $37,800 to bring him home, when can we hang out? Let me know. Shoot me an email. I'd love to come hang out at your house, and maybe, I won't put it on, I promise, because I'll end up tearing it because God knows that I'm bigger than both Kevin Mangold and Mark Brian Wilson. But the point here is that somebody took it home, and it's got to be pretty cool to have that in your collection. Also on offer, and just as cool, although in far worse shape, was the original Stay Puft hat, and this enormous foam hat actually sold for more than double its expected maximum value of $20,000 at a whopping $44,000. I have to say that I was surprised by this because of the two pieces. I felt that Slimer was the way more interesting and displayable thing, but I have to hand it to Jason Fitzsimmons, who commented when he was on Extraplasm that these could both go for well over their estimated value, and that he thought the hat would actually do better than the Thirsty Spud, and he was right. So some items also just didn't sell again. The terror dog foot and toes used in the scene where we first see them break out of the statues in Dana Barrett's apartment building once again did not sell for the second prop store auction in which they were featured in Los Angeles. And again, these were actually from the collection of Boss Films, Ghost Shop, and effects legend Stuart Ziff, also at the auction. Stuart Ziff. I had the chance to meet Stuart alongside Slimer in a brief meeting when I first arrived at the event, thanks to an introduction from JD. So thank you again to JD Raymer for that. We got a quick photo together that you can see over on the Extraplasm Instagram page. And, maybe we'll get to see him again if they auction off his, terror dog foot again. One of us at some point has to actually buy it. But I have to say that just as our friends from the Containment Unit and TCU Collectibles have expressed, Stu was incredibly kind and nice enough to chat with me for a few minutes. So it was pretty cool. I have to say, I never imagined that I was going to walk up and meet Slimer, or at least, see him, because I didn't meet him. He wasn't talking to me or anything. But then also have somebody who was coordinating and managing the Ghost Shop turn around and introduce them to me right after that. It was pretty wild. And in non-Ghostbusters news from that event, I will also say I also got to meet and greet with John Delancey, aka Q from Star Trek The Next Generation, as well as plenty of other Star Trek shows after it, which was freaking bananas for me as a person who loves Star Trek as much as he loves Ghostbusters. So if you're in the LA area when prop store events are happening, these previews, you've got to come check them out because they're a lot of fun. They're totally free. They often have an open bar, and the experience is very cool. So thanks to the folks at Prop Store for a lovely experience, and congrats to the one or two of you who might be listening right now while unboxing your $40,000 one-of-one Grail piece. In Halloween Horror Nights news, which I'm just making its own category this week because there's so much stuff to talk about and a plethora of reveals have happened since we last chatted. I was joking a few weeks ago about Ivan's NYC Deli needing sandwiches. I want to say I still think this. In fact, I want to make t-shirts for the alternate universe where Ivan Reitman ran a submarine sandwich shop, and I very well just might roll my own on that because I won't be buying that from the Universal Studios store because it doesn't exist. But there's some updates about Ivan's Deli and other things that you can get in the merch shop. It seems that the food stands that were under construction we talked about last episode have continued to get some decor added to them, with Slimer being added to Ivan's Deli and the mini puffs being added to the Frozen Firehouse stand. But let's be honest, What we really care about more than the decor is what you'll be able to eat at these stands. And as revealed by the Instagram accounts Thrills, Taste and Travels and Expedition Theme Park, and of course then reported on by our friend Jason over at Ghostbusters News, the food options for Horror Nights will include an open-faced roasted Marshmallow Man s'more that looks both adorable and delicious, and a bizarre Death Chill-inspired dipped mint cheesecake that is apparently then topped with blue icing, edible glitter, and the 1980s throwback corn-based snack Bugles to evoke frozen spikes. Who knew these even still existed since my grandmother died and stopped buying them like a decade ago? I want to eat this just so I can understand what this flavor combination would even be like. But I have to say, at a visual appeal level, if this was a paranormal bake-off, I'm choosing the puffed. And I really want someone at Universal to just take the mold for it and sell it in the merch shop so I can use it to somehow make crazy bread puffs or garlic bread puffs or to freeze milk and ice cream inside of him for weird videos where he's thrown into a blender and made into a shake. And are you hearing me, Sony Consumer Products Division? Are you understanding the cool thing I'm talking about right now? Because we need it. Anyway, among the other Horror Nights reveals since we last talked are some merch reveals, including a Slimer hat that does not suck. And I'm going to emphasize that because having seen the first wave of Horror Nights merch that Universal rushed out at the announcement of the Ghostbusters Frozen Empire house, the previous hat was an atrocious nightmare of fast fashion that was lower quality than the random packages full of knockoff bootleg Ghostbusters crap from Temu that my friend Ed from college keeps sending me as a quarterly gag gift. And if you think I'm kidding about that, I have a bootleg plush throw that is shedding all over my office right now to give you. I want this hat. It features Slimer eating pizza, it's embroidered and not iron-on or direct-to-garment, and it's freaking wonderful. There's also a less exciting Ghostbusters mini-puffed headband that I don't really want, but there's also a Frozen Empire-themed shot glass that I do really want. And there's some tank tops that glow in the dark that, even if I did want them, I should never wear because I would make them look terrible, and a cool black jacket that features patches of the same Slimer eating pizza and the Horror Nights logo with green accents. There's way more stuff to see for sure that I'm probably not covering, and rather than me trying to recap all of these items and describe all their varied price points to you, I'm going to direct you over to Ghostbusters News to check out the depth of coverage on this that Jason has provided over the last week. And some of these merch items may make it to the online store, but as of now, these items remain things you can only grab down at one of the 2 Universal Studios theme parks or from people who are going down to the theme park and buying as many as possible and bringing them on eBay to charge you way too much money. Don't do that. Find a friend who either lives in Florida or lives in California, but don't make that friend me right now because I got a lot of things to do. Let's do some fast merch news and probably not comprehensive merch news, given how much has come out in the last week for Halloween. And we'll split off here from the, sort of merch we're talking about for Universal Studios. But Spirit Halloween stores are now opening nationwide in the US, and your local Undead Toys R Us, Tuesday Morning, or Bed Bath & Beyond store is now rising from its grave under orange and black banners. Spirit has a ton of new character costume options available that I talked about last episode. You should totally go and check those out on their website or hop over to Ghostbusters News to find that stuff easily. But one item that I really wanted to touch on and highlight real quick that is back as an online-only exclusive is their foam hanging Slimer prop. We haven't seen this released again since I think perhaps the year before or the year of COVID, and thus prices for it have fluctuated a bit wildly online on eBay. And while it's not the most screen-accurate version of Slimer, it's a completely serviceable prop that will cost you less than $75 before you add in your 20% off coupon on one item. And I know, I've owned 2 of these for years for no good reason other than I kept finding, them really cheap on November 1st inside of Spirit Halloween stores and buying them for half off because, hey, Spirit only wanted half of their asking price to adopt a ghost from their shelter and take him home, so I did. But for a foam prop, I've been pretty impressed at just how much abuse they've taken. One has survived an 8-foot fall off a shelf while landing on his arms more than once in my house. I will tell you that point blank. He's thrown himself on the floor, and I've yet to get a tear or a crack or anything in them. So while I could never feel comfortable endorsing a $600 foam terror dog from Spirit Halloween because what the frick, are you actually kidding me? I can certainly say grab one of these guys while they're still back in production for less than $75. And some final merchandise bullet points to hit here to wrap up sort of the official merch stuff that we're going to talk about. Old Navy has 2 unisex t-shirts available right now, including a green slimed Ghostbusters logo shirt for kids and a shirt featuring the showdown between Gozer and the Ghostbusters in the original 1984 film for adults. Those shirts come in a wide array of sizes and were maybe produced by Ripple Junction for Old Navy under contract, given what we learned from previous guest David Miyakawa about how Ripple Junction designs end up on store shelves. The kids shirt will run you $14.99 and the adult shirt will run you $19.99, but here's my tip. Old Navy pretty much always runs a big sale for Labor Day, which is like next week, so take a look at the end of the week to see if there's a good promo code to use. One additional merchandise item we should talk about real quick is that Hallmark has an 8-bit inspired Ghostbusters enamel pin that they're going to be offering only at New York Comic Con in October as part of their Pixelate series of products. That's spelled PXL8 if you're a fan of cute anagrams and weird ways of spelling things like you're texting people. But this is a series of products that reimagine beloved IP as pixelated artwork. So this is going to be a pin that features Slimer as if he was a video game character. There's only going to be 500 of these available at $10 each, and they're only going to be at the Hallmark booth at New York Comic Con. So if you're planning on going to NYCC, you need to put this on your list of places to go. Make sure you hit that booth early in the morning to get the pin before it's gone. And if you're not going to NYCC and you collect enamel pins, you need to find a friend who is going and beg them so you don't have to spend too much money on eBay. And maybe this is a good opportunity to remember, which franchises go to NYCC each year so you can make sure that you bug them, because I'm sure that Dan and Chris from Buffalo and Ryan from NYC Ghostbusters want nothing more than to go and buy us all enamel pins and ship them out to us individually. I mean, after all, Dan and Chris got so good at that when they sold merch from the Firehouse, right? I'm kidding. Don't really bug them about these things. But by the same token, Dan, Chris, Ryan, can you give me a pin? Our final Ghostbusters headline of the week, we're going to talk for a couple moments about what our friends Matt Sanders and Tom Henry are doing over at TCU Collectibles, aka the Ghostbusters Containment Unit autograph collecting group on Facebook. Matt and Tom recently returned from their Busters Across California tour, where they were out here meeting with lots of folks from the Ghost Shop, from Boss Films, folks like William Atherton, Hank Mayo, Stuart Ziff, etc. This was a really cool trip where they were out here and getting lots of things signed for folks who had pre-ordered them, and now all those items have been shipped out, and for the first time in many years, Tom is doing a dance of joy about having no items to ship out in his house. But they do have some additional items to sell at this point that they're putting into a mystery box and mystery bag format. So for $40, you can get a TCU mystery bag that will include either an 8x10 or a ray gun card that's been signed at a bare minimum. For $100, you can get a mystery box that's going to contain 2 items, one of which will be a smaller format item such as a ray gun card or an 8x10, and one of which is going to be the first time that the guys over at TCU have dug into their large format archives. They're going to go into the large format inventory for things that are at least 11x14 in size as part of those boxes. So if you are interested in getting some mystery autographs where you're not sure what you're necessarily going to get at an affordable price, it's $40 for the bag, where you're going to get at least one item as an 8x10 or a card, and it's $100 for the box, where you're going to get at least 2 items, and one of which is going to be larger format. And again, this is something I should say that they are saying at least, and if you've done this before, then you should know that there's usually randomly inserted multi-signed items. There's rare and key signers and other kinds of surprises that they will toss into these bags and boxes. I even believe that there was a Bill Murray that escaped in the last one, believe it or not. So this is pretty cool. It's something where, Matt and Tom have come on the show a ton, and you've heard me talk about how great they are. And if you've bought stuff from them in the past, they're outstanding at dealing with these autographs and things. And so knowing who they just came back from seeing and whose extras they may have bought, you have a great opportunity here right now to get some really cool stuff that you may never be able to get again, because who knows if these people will end up signing again. And to be clear, the run of stuff that they may be putting in these boxes runs longer than just what came back from the recent trip. But I'm sure, in my brain at least, that they probably have some things that they got from the recent trip that will end up in the box. Shipping cost on these will be based on your location, is one thing I should add here, just so you know. There's also a really cool option for you if you don't want to play the mystery game, but you want to get something really unique, limited, and autographed. They have a small number of their Mayor Peck campaign posters left. These were individually numbered to a run of 40 and hand signed by William Atherton, and I actually got to watch him sign each and every one of them, which is kind of cool. So I won't be able to pick out yours if you buy one, but I will have seen yours get signed because I got to see them all get signed, and they are outstanding. These are posters that were actually designed by Eric Christensen of the Moogly Fan Club, who's also been on Extraplasm in the past and who does all kinds of things to design patches and pins and challenge coins and a ton of different cool stuff in our community. They are outstanding posters that essentially take the idea of the Obama Hope and Change aesthetic, the Old Shepherd Ferry posters from Obama's campaign back in 2008, and they kind of apply that aesthetic to Peck as opposed to Hope and Change, which is kind of great. There's also included in there, not only do you get your signed poster, but you also will get a Peck campaign button that Matt and Tom had made up, and I actually own one of these. They're really cool. So that'll run you $100, but it's going to be a guaranteed print of, I believe, an 11 by 17 signed poster, a Finch campaign button, and William Atherton's signature on it. So it's pretty awesome. There's only 40 of these produced, and there's a limited number of them still available that weren't already pre-ordered. So again, if you want to grab these, go ahead and get them. The way to order is email slimedsignatures@gmail.com to contact Matt and Tom and find out a bit more about how to get involved in this. And again, $40 for the mystery bag, $100 for the mystery box, $100 for the Peck Pack plus shipping. These are outstanding prices to walk away with, one or more awesome autographs to add to your collection. Okay, so that about wraps up Ghostbusters headlines. We're going to go now on a bit of a time-traveling trip back to November of 2022, and what was then a nascent version of Extraplasm reaching its first double-digit episode. So come along as we travel back 2 years, and then about 100 more as we dig into the history of Engine 23. And then after this remastered and re-edited take on that history, I'll give you an update on the current state of the Firehouse project before we wrap up the episode. So keep your hands and arms inside the car at all times, and keep your personal items secured, and away we go. Welcome to Extraplasm Podcast, Spectral Speculation Edition, Ghost Stories of a Haunted Firehouse. This week, we're going to talk a bit about the Ghostbusters Firehouse, but perhaps not the Ghostbusters Firehouse that most people think of when they look at merchandise in their own homes, or autographed photos they have of Ghostbusters standing in front of a firehouse, or go on vacation in New York City. Because most of us tend to think about Hook and Ladder 8, the firehouse in New York City that served as the exterior location for Ghostbusters and Ghostbusters 2, as the Ghostbusters Firehouse. And there's good reason for that. Our playsets as kids, or perhaps even as adults, look like that building. The things that are produced by different manufacturers such as Funko and others who are making little smaller versions of the firehouse look like Hook and Ladder 8 in New York City. I mean, even Hook and Ladder 8's Twitter account is official Ghostbusters HQ, or their Instagram account. But the reality is that that's only the exterior of the building, because the interior of the Ghostbusters headquarters is actually an old retired firehouse in Skid Row in Los Angeles. It is a location that has been utilized not just for Ghostbusters and Ghostbusters 2, but was also featured in Big Trouble in Little China, as well as in the movie The Mask, and a variety of other different productions, from television commercials to TV shows to movies. That firehouse has been in a lot of different stuff. But most people don't realize that when Egon Spengler says in Ghostbusters that the firehouse is in the midst of a demilitarized zone, in some ways, they were in fact in a pretty sketchy area, because Skid Row is the largest population of transient people who are living in America today. And I say that not to be judgmental, but to say sort of brass tacks, that Skid Row is an area of Los Angeles that has been in large part for many decades, many generations, cordoned off by the city as a place of deep poverty and deep strife and struggle. And today, we're going to talk a bit about the firehouse that everything happens inside of in Ghostbusters and Ghostbusters 2, that sits inside of a lot of that strife. Engine 23 and Truck Company 5 is what's actually written on the exterior of the Ghostbusters Firehouse in Los Angeles. And the building is one that is culturally revered and important, and we're going to talk today about why. But I want to take you back to the history of this building and teach you about where it came from and sort of how it's always had a level of political scandal and struggle that it's been dealing with even from its inception. And I want to teach you a bit about the history of the building and how it got started, and how the building was constructed and what's so important about it, how it ended up being considered a cultural icon and being placed into protection because of its heritage, not because of anything to do with filming, but because of its heritage as a fire department, and also a fire department that's architecturally unique. And then to talk a bit about the fire department scandal that then came through the 80s and 90s because of all the filming that went on at the location. And finally, what's going on with the firehouse today. And so I hope you'll come along on this journey, because I think of the Ghostbusters Firehouse and I think of the place that they are inside of. And I've always wanted to be inside of this building, even though it might be really harrowing to go down there and check it out, because I am a person who tends to get really motivated and really emotional about being in places where filming happened or where experiences happened. And as much as it's great to see the exterior of a building, to be able to stand in the exact space that any of the principal actors or the director or any of the people who were involved in Ghostbusters were in for days working on filming that movie is one of the things I would love to have happen in my life. So come along with me on this journey, find out a bit about the Ghostbusters Firehouse, the actual inside of the Ghostbusters Firehouse. And we're going to begin our journey back in the Wayback Machine, back in September of 1910. In September of 1910, Engine Company 23 and Truck Company 5 opened as an extravagant piece of architecture that was unique in design. It was also highly criticized, coming in at a cost of over $53,000, according to the LA Times in 1910, which would roughly come out to about $1.8 million today. At the time that the firehouse was built, the commissioners who signed off on it actually denied knowing it would be this opulent, because of the number of critics that came out and said that the firehouse was a bit ridiculous. This is largely because, as the LA Times pointed out, it cost enough money that they could have built 3 firehouses with the budget that they spent on one. So this is largely because of the way in which the firehouse was put together and what was in it. In the terms of, say, Jurassic Park and John Hammond, they spared no expense. This is in large part because the firehouse served as the entire department's headquarters and the chief's residence. So this was not just a new firehouse, but it was also going to serve as the headquarters for the entire department and also the place that the chief would be living and based out of. So there's a really good chance that some of those commissioners did know how much things were going to cost, and they really wanted to make sure that that was going to be an outstanding place to have as your headquarters and also for the chief to live. And so they ended up erecting a building that is among the narrowest buildings in the entire city of Los Angeles. The building is 26 feet wide and 52 feet tall, and it actually spans from 5th Street to Winston Street, and the entire ground floor is an arcade with entrances and exits on each end. It's 168 feet deep because it's essentially an entire city block's depth of houses or residential buildings from one end to the other. And it was filled with some of the greatest technology of the day, including a passenger elevator with safety protections to only run with closed doors that ran to the 3rd floor. There was a private elevator up to the 3rd floor penthouse area, as we'll call it, and we'll talk about that in a moment. It had a freight elevator and a lift that ran from the basement to the 3rd floor as well. And specifically, it went to the hayloft, which we'll talk about the horses that were inside the firehouse in a moment. And it had steam heat and electric automated fire bells and automated facilities for horses. So essentially, when the fire bells would go off, the horses were inside their stables and the gates and things for the horses would end up opening up so that way the horses could come out easily. So it was a really automated firehouse for its day. It had a lot of different technological features to allow for quick response to fire and implemented a lot of new technology. And it had been designed, although it had horses when it opened, the ground floor arcade was designed to hold both horses and an auto truck with a 65-foot ladder. So here was your first actual auto truck for the city of Los Angeles. This is an important thing to think about, that not only did they have this amazing historic fire department, but this was also the first fire department to be given an automated ladder truck to work with. So it didn't actually come into use for at least a couple years, but it was designed, the building, to accommodate both horses and a ladder truck. And in reality, it turns out that Engine 23 and Truck Company 5, or as I'm going to sort of call it to make things a little easier here, sometimes Firehouse 23 or just Engine 23. Engine 23 was the last firehouse to be built to support horses. So it's an interesting thing to think about that it was the first firehouse to have an auto truck that had a ladder that was automated, and it was the last firehouse to actually be built to support horses. And there were 10 horses with stables that were there to move the fire engine. And at that time, when they referred to an engine, they meant as a steam engine that would be working to power things like pumps to move water, etc. So really kind of weird to think about. It's a transitional moment. It's kind of this transition between the horse-drawn era of firefighting and moving to mechanized automation. And all of that went into the design of the firehouse. They wanted it to be cutting edge and top of the line and have the greatest technology, alongside also being a beautiful place that was well designed and almost like a fire palace. So we're going to talk a bit about what that was like in terms of the features of the firehouse, in terms of how it was designed. And so the ground floor arcade was 24 feet wide. The building itself was 26, and the ground floor, when you consider the walls, etc., the open space was 24 feet wide at a 21-foot tall ceiling. So you have a building that essentially the ground floor is almost as tall as it is wide. And as we talked about a few moments ago, it's 168 feet deep that spanned from 5th Street to Winston Street. The entire ceiling in the ground floor had pressed steel. So when you think about Ghostbusters and you think about how the ceiling looks above their heads and it has that pattern in it, it's because that is a pressed steel ceiling that was actually pressed into position with that pattern. It also had repressed vitrified brick flooring, and as many of us who've watched Ghostbusters know, it had white tiles that were shining brilliantly white with green accents and enamel. So the whole arcade area was designed in a way that it was supposed to be a large open space to get equipment in and out, but it was also, designed to look gorgeous for people coming in to be able to look at it and see it as a luxury place to be. In fact, the LA Times in 1910, when the firehouse opened, joked that the fire chief would have to wear evening dress after 6 p.m. because the facility was so luxurious. Whereas the first floor of the firehouse is designated for equipment, for horses, the second floor is designated for the firefighters themselves. The second floor was the place where you had the dormitory for firefighters who were living there, which had 20 hospital beds and a locker room with 20 lockers, as well as the quarters of the captain of the house, an assembly room, and a reading room with built-in bookcases with doors of leaded glass. The entire second floor was decorated in white oak finish, and there were 6 brass fire poles that ran from the second floor down to the first floor. The second floor had concrete floors and white enamel tile bathrooms as well. So the white tile theme that you would see downstairs continued upstairs in the bathroom areas, whereas the rest of the environment was decorated in a white oak finish. It was when you went up to the third floor of the firehouse that you really saw how opulent things got. The third floor was essentially almost like a penthouse suite, except it was divided up to allow for residential space for a chief as well as a visiting chief. And so the third floor was kind of like an opulent penthouse the LA Fire Department chief lived in full time. And then if other chiefs were coming in to do business in town, they could utilize the space. It had a reception room with a large bow window that looked out over the street. It had oak floors and white stucco ceiling with mantles of marble that went around the inside of the room. So the reception room had this mantle of marble that was carved out of stone, obviously, and Peruvian mahogany paneling with leather coverets and 7-foot enormous French bevel glass mirrors. So this was a place of opulence. It was designed to be like a reception room where you could run events. And so it was not like your average living room. It was something like a ballroom almost. And the chief's suite had a marble standing shower and a tub that was described by the LA Times as being large enough for 2 large chiefs, as well as a bedroom that the LA Times of 1910 described as being a boudoir featuring a large brass bed and 3 mahogany lockers. The chief's suite had a private elevator that ran from the first floor all the way to the third floor, and that was the primary way to access it. And there was a private brass sliding pole that went down to the second floor. So essentially, the chief had his own fire pole and had his own elevator as a way to get in and out of the building alongside the stairs. And then the third floor also had a secondary suite, which also had its own reception room. So the deputy chief or visiting chief didn't just have like, hey, here's your own room, but they had their own suite with their own reception room with the matching accoutrements of the one I just described. It had the marble mantle, it had the Peruvian mahogany, it had the mirrors, etc. So essentially, it was almost like a copy of the other room. There was an additional single room with a bathroom for emergency quarters for other visiting personnel who might be coming into town. So if you had like a long-term visiting chief who was there doing business from another area in California, who was going to be there for several weeks, they may be occupying that deputy chief's suite. And then you might have an emergency and have someone else who comes into the environment. You had an additional room with a private bathroom that you could give to that person. And so that kind of sets up what Engine 23 was when it first opened. It was a new firehouse that was cutting edge in terms of its technology. It had a lot of aesthetic value placed into it in terms of making it not just another firehouse, but one that was going to be, as the LA Times of later would call it, the Taj Mahal of firehouses, such that it was not just a place to come and work if you were a firefighter, but it was supposed to be an icon that represented the entire department. It was supposed to serve as the department's headquarters and essentially be what people would think of when they thought about the place where firefighting came from. Which to me is kind of funny because it's kind of like thinking about the place where ghostbusting comes from. It's iconic. And so it was intended to be an iconic building. They wanted it to be that. Whether or not people wanted to take credit for it afterwards because they were being criticized for how much it cost, it was pretty clear that there was an intent to make this a cultural waypoint in terms of the city. By the 1920s, some significant changes started to happen to Engine 23, and one of them is that the first woman to live in a firehouse in LA moved in. And that's largely because Chief Ralph J. Scott ended up marrying Addie Haas, and they began their family life in the firehouse. In 1920, when Scott becomes chief, he decides to move the headquarters from their location there in the building to Hill and 2nd Street, to a firehouse that no longer exists and has been since torn down. And the entire 3rd floor was turned into a living quarters suite for just the chief. So whereas before the chief originally had about half of that space and was sharing it with visiting personnel, now the entire 3rd floor would be turned into a family suite for the chief and his family. And the showrooms were converted into living room space, and the visiting chief's quarters were turned into a kitchen. So the Scotts ended up living on the top floor until 1927 when they moved out and went to a home that they built. But that 3rd floor space ended up housing the fire chiefs from 1910 out till about 1930. The horses ended up leaving the firehouse, and the station became a motorized unit entirely as well during the 1920s. And April 29th, 1921 is the last date that a horse-drawn run happened from the firehouse. And that information comes to us according to LA Fire Department Captain Larry Schneider, who runs the Los Angeles Fire Department Historical Archive, hosted at lafire.com. And so essentially, if you think about how long the horses were there, the fire department opened in 1910. The horses came in at the same time as the first auto truck, and the horses were out of the fire department by the end of 1921. So they were there about 11 years at most. So kind of interesting to think about that that's the last fire department that was built for horses, and they weren't even there for much more than a decade before the entire process of firefighting had changed such that there was no reason to continue to have them around. So at that point, the ground floor horse stalls were dismantled because they were no longer needed. And presumably the hayloft on the 3rd floor, which was also present behind the chief's penthouse on the opposite side of the building, that was also cleared out and no longer needed. So at this point, not a lot changes. From the 1920s forward, it's a firehouse. It operates as a firehouse. There's changes in personnel. There's changes in technology. There's certainly changes to the neighborhood because Skid Row is kind of deteriorating around the firehouse, especially in the post-Depression era. Things don't really get much better, right? As much as the country gets better after the Depression, Skid Row doesn't really rebound. And so the firehouse continues to operate, and it operates in a context that is kind of getting sketchier and sketchier. And by the time we reach 1960, the building's life as a firehouse ends. And instead, sort of a period of neglect by the city begins. So in 1960, the firehouse is given its closing date, and the firefighters who are there move on. It's deemed obsolete, and as the neighborhood declines around it, the fire department elects to close it and relocate its staff and assets to another location. The building is kind of just left. They close it up, they lock it up, and it's just kind of sitting there. And at points it's being broken into, and people are getting inside and doing things to it and taking things out of it. And it's obviously been a pretty significant investment. At that point in 1960, the building is essentially about 50 years old, and obviously the city spent a lot of money to build it. So the Los Angeles Cultural Heritage Board steps in 1966 to declare the building a historic cultural monument in order to protect it from being razed as different ideas are coming into being about what to do with old properties in the downtown area, and particularly in Skid Row, where people are getting into buildings and stealing things and doing different stuff they shouldn't be doing. So they saved the building from being razed in 1966. And the Department of Public Works ends up with the responsibility to take care of the building and manage it, and they kind of don't. The building is kind of left to rot in Skid Row through the 1960s, and there's not anybody really maintaining it or doing anything with it or making sure that things are fine with it. In fact, by 1974, the Department of Public Works tries to raise the building themselves by deeming that it's seismically unsafe due to what they believe is brick construction that in an earthquake would crumble apart and the building would come down upon anybody who was inside, except that they're wrong. In fact, a second inspection of the building reveals that the building, because it was built so technologically sound for what it was at the turn of the century, was one of the first concrete buildings to be built in the city of Los Angeles, and thus was one of the most seismically stable old buildings in the entire downtown area at the time. And so the Department of Public Works, even though they kind of have a bit of a mission to get rid of the building in 1974, they kind of can't get it done. And at the same time, throughout the 60s and the early 70s, the building gets looted. By the time we get to 1974, most of the copper tubing that's in the building, the brass fire poles, etc., they're gone. They've been taken out by looters who have taken to scrap them and get money for them. So the building is in some serious disrepair after the 1960s and through the 1970s. In 1978, Public Works decides to agree to allow a tenant named James Croak to live on the premises as a caretaker. And Croak was the first tenant to move into the firehouse in 18 years, and he basically moved in an as-is condition. He was a general contractor and a construction worker, and so essentially he was given the task of living in the building rent-free while working to help to rehabilitate it. And he told the LA Times when he was interviewed about this in the 1980s and 1990s that he had been dealing with a lot of trash that had been piled up around the building for many years. And when he first showed up, he had to clear out trash just to get inside the building that had been piled up around it. And then once he was inside, he had to secure it from being an open hotel, quote unquote, to local transients, vagrants, folks who were just coming in and stealing things from the building or sleeping inside and squatting, etc. And so he used his skills as a carpenter and a licensed general contractor to remove coats of old paint from the mahogany, to repair the tile work and the moldings, and otherwise spruce up the building. In fact, he is the person who ends up getting the funding, and we'll talk about where in a moment, and the resources to put fire poles back in place after they've been torn out. And so Croak does a lot of work through the late 70s, like from 1978 on and through the early 80s, to clean up the firehouse and restore it back to a point that looks like it does in 1984 when we see it on screen. It's not covered in paint and graffiti and grime and stuff and people living inside of it. Rather, it's a place that's been really cleaned up to be spick and span, especially down on the bottom floor where a lot of the filming went on. So we're going to talk about that filming and how it gets started in a second. The filming at Engine 23 really begins in 1979, and along with it comes a brand new political scandal. In 1979, Croak claims he was approached by a television commercial location scout who had an interest in using the firehouse as a filming location because of the massive amount of space that it had, as well as the architecture that was really unique. And Croak agrees to this, and turns out that particular scout is not alone. Other people have seen the building and word spreads about this space. And Croak begins taking in revenue to the tune of $1,500 to $5,000 a day in film fees that he's using to help pay for refurbishing the building. So by his testimony that he would end up giving later on in life, he did not pocket this money. It wasn't really so much revenue for him as much as he's working in the building and he's living there rent free, and he doesn't have the money to actually go out and buy a lot of the materials himself. He told the LA Times in 1995, "I was not a wealthy person, so I just hit on the idea that I'd have these film guys come in and use the money to fix the place up." So he's getting $1,500 to $5,000 a day in 1979 money, which today is a lot more money. I'm not going to do the inflation calculation right now while we're talking, but I think that if you think about what's going on, he's got a lot of revenue coming in per day for these film projects, and he's taking that and then putting it back into materials. It's how an individual affords, giant brass fire poles, because he's getting film budgets that are being spent in the location that he is the caretaker of. In 1979, the fire department goes back to the city and says, we want to build a museum and we would like to use Engine 23 to do it. And so the firehouse is something that the city is trying to save from being crushed in different contexts or razed, ends up being earmarked as a property designated for the Los Angeles Fire Department's use as a museum. And in directing the department to develop that museum, the council of the city made a motion, and they stated in the motion that no city money was to be used to fund the project, and that the station, quote unquote, could not be used for any other purpose. And this order also authorized fire officials to go and seek contributions to be placed in a trust fund in the city treasury. So essentially, they said, we are not going to pay for a museum, but we will give you the building to utilize. Don't come ask us for the money to fund the museum, but do go and seek contributions from others to fund the museum and put that money in a trust fund in the city treasury or retain it by a nonprofit organization. So let that sink in for a moment, because it's going to become really important in a few minutes when we talk about what ends up happening with this money. But the long and short of it is that 1979, the city says, fire department, you can use the building for a museum, but you need to come up with the funds yourself on how to actually renovate the building and then run a museum and operate it in the space. So we're not going to pay for it. Go out and generate and raise that revenue and either give it to the city treasury or retain it by a proper nonprofit organization. 2 years later, in 1981, members of the fire department's senior leadership formed a nonprofit public benefit organization with the goal of soliciting donations to develop and run their museum. And the name of this organization was Old 23. Now, the board of directors of Old 23 included a retired fire chief, John Gerard, the deputy chief, Gerald Johnson, who was essentially the acting chief until a new chief was coming in, and fire commissioners Ann Reese Lane and John Lawson. And Chief Donald Manning would join them in 1983 when he joined the department on the board of directors. Now, for a long time, people have sort of suggested, why are they building whatever they're building downtown or in Skid Row out of the firehouse? There's been discussions of a youth arts center more recently and things. And I think it's kind of ironic because back in 1981, when people were talking about building a fire museum in Skid Row, there was some criticism of this in terms of city politics and in terms of local news. And in the face of that criticism, Johnson told the Los Angeles Times in 1981, this whole area is rescheduled for redevelopment. Down the road, it won't look like this. You have to remember that 23 actually was the headquarters of the fire department at one time. And I find this kind of amusing in a way because this is often the story of things in downtown LA. There's a resource here. It's in the middle of something that's really dangerous or that's really a struggle for the people who are here. What do we do about that struggle? I don't know, but don't worry, we're going to redevelop this building and all the other buildings around it, and down the road, it won't be like this. So, not to get super political about LA local politics, but it's an interesting thing to consider that even back in 1981, the discussion of why you'd build a fire museum in the midst of the largest homeless population in America, and this is before a lot of things get even worse from the ending of mental health programs and things that happens through the 80s, there's this expectation that we'll build this here and it will just improve around it. So the firehouse is given to the fire department. It's their job now to work on rebuilding it, restoring it, fixing it, etc. But that's all they're supposed to be doing with it at that point. They've been told explicitly that they're not supposed to use it for any other purpose other than a museum. But despite those provisions that the firehouse be used only as a museum, Old 23 ended up finding out that they inherited a tenant. So not only did they get a building, but they also got a tenant who lived inside named James Croak. And they went to James Croak and they said, you need to start to pay us $400 a month in rent. Currently, you're here living rent free and we want you to pay us $400 a month in rent. We've taken control of the building from Public Works. A nonprofit organization now owns the building, which wasn't really so much true because they didn't own it as much as they were managing it. The city still owns it. And the fire department had the ability to renegotiate rent paid by its tenant, so they wanted $400 a month. And Croak agreed to stop construction and renovation work once the museum plans were finalized and to start paying $400 a month in rent. Filming on the premises also continued, but now with Old 23's involvement. So again, despite the fact that the city council said you could use the building only as a museum and not for any other purpose, now the building was being used as a filming location, including with the fire department's involvement. And they were taking a quote unquote piece of the action, according to Croak's statements to the LA Times in 1995. So ironically enough, the first film that Old 23 ended up receiving funds for was in fact Ghostbusters. A 1995 audit of Old 23's financial management revealed that tax records from 1984 show a $3,000 donation for Ghostbusters from Columbia Pictures. Now, this is kind of interesting because these kinds of payments probably would have been illegal, not only because the building was not supposed to be used for any activity other than a museum, but because Old 23 was functionally taking in business revenue and payment for services rendered, in other words, like subleasing the space or utilizing it or renting it to film in, but they were treating those funds as if they were nonprofit donations. So this is sort of like a form of quid pro quo, right? Where you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You give me money and I will let you use my firehouse that's actually a public resource and that belongs to the city and not me personally, right? So it's kind of what's going on in this context. So this is pretty dicey. And by 1985, Croak elects to move out of the location and he's no longer involved. And he ultimately finds his way to New York. Old 23 replaces him with a new tenant named Daniel Taylor, who ultimately becomes the last tenant that Engine 23 will have before its renovation begins, because he's there that long. When Taylor comes in, he tells the LA Times in 1995 that he was placed on a $400 month-to-month lease, so the same lease that Croak had been on. The lease stipulated that the premises were to be used as a caretaker residence for the Los Angeles City Fire Department Museum. And the lease was kind of weird too, because the lease was not signed or stamped by the city clerk's office and had been modified like with a typewriter by typing in two provisions on the very bottom of it. One, that the fire chief could terminate the lease at any time for any reason. And two, that quote unquote, the lessee also agrees that the lessor may conduct motion picture filming upon said premises. Now, Daniel Taylor told the LA Times in 1995 that he was placed in charge of operating filming on the premises as part of his lease agreement. So he was told that he was supposed to collect $500 for Old 23 each time the station was used. And he told the LA Times, quote unquote, "They laid the book out for me and I followed the book." And Taylor additionally noted to the LA Times that he was told to cash checks received from production companies and convert them to cash or money order donations to give to Old 23. And so this essentially obfuscated the sources of revenue, because it would mean that they would not be able to trace back as easily whether or not checks had been cashed or canceled checks were coming out of Old 23's accounts, as much as cash donations were now going to be given to Old 23. And Taylor would charge $1,000 to $2,000 a day to use the site, often keeping excess revenue for services he rendered as part of an unlicensed production company he was operating on the premises. So there's some examples of this in a 1995 LA Times article about this whole controversy, that are things like Taylor dressing up parts of the firehouse as a blues club for a location, and then people coming in and filming in it, and he's charging $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, and he's giving a $500 cut to Old 23, this nonprofit organization, but essentially he's making a lot of money, right? He's generating a lot of revenue. And at the same time as he's generating all this revenue, his production company is entirely unlicensed. So he doesn't have any of the licenses that he would require to actually run a production company in the space or to lease the space out. But when questioned about this, all he can tell the LA Times is, all I know is that my lease allows me to do what I'm doing, quote unquote. And so he's running a business in the space, but not necessarily with any insurance, not with any of the things that you would need to legally run the business properly. And keep in mind that it's still a firehouse that is, built in 1910 and has been sitting largely uninspected or unmanaged, except for one guy who was living inside and fixing things up with the money that he was getting from doing filming in the building. So this starts to become an even more dicey story, because as filming profits boom at the firehouse and they're making more and more money, now the chief Manning and the deputy chief Johnson begin campaigning in the 1980s for a new location for their museum. They go to the local politicians in the city and start talking about how they have this firehouse they've been given to build a museum, but it's totally not appropriate to put it where it is because the firehouse is in Skid Row. And additionally, the building is so old that we don't even know what its condition is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they go and talk about how they want to get a new museum because they can't use the one they have. And at the same time as they're doing this, between 1988 and 1995, 54 films and productions had permits to shoot at the firehouse. And meanwhile, payments for only about half of these can be found in financial records. So they're talking about how the building is so unreasonable to use as a museum at the same time as 54 different productions are coming in and shooting in a space that hasn't really been vetted. And as they're going around and publicly advocating that Skid Row is no longer accessible, they're trying to find a new space essentially to leave this filming space open. So they lobby local politicians for an alternative site, and ultimately the fire department decides to build its museum in Hollywood, and they don't end up using Engine 23 for a museum at all. But weirdly enough, they still keep Old 23, the organization that's been taking all this money for a museum, open. And they still continue to solicit donations at the same time as they still continue to control the building they now don't intend to use for a museum. Now keep in mind, the city's policy was you can have the building as long as you use it and only use it for a museum. Now they've decided to move their museum somewhere else. But this is one of those things that sort of falls through the cracks of local city politics, and nobody really notices this is going on for quite some time. So they continue to utilize the building to continue filming. And at the same time as they're using the building for filming, the city goes off and starts building a museum for the fire department. At no point does Old 23 take $92,000 in donations that it had in its bank accounts, according to the LA Times, and give any of it to the city. So at this point, we're talking about in the 1980s, like late 1980s, probably shortly before or right around the same time that Ghostbusters 2 is being filmed, because it's about 1988, 1989, that they're getting this successful move to a new environment for the museum. And they don't offer up any of what was $92,000 in their savings at that point. And what's really weird is that that money is not being given to the city treasury, and it was supposed to be held in a nonprofit account. But it turns out it's not. In fact, the money's been put into a private account. It's only accessible to Manning and Johnson. This starts to get really, really weird, because now you have an organization that's soliciting funds for a project that's no longer happening. If it is happening, it's happening somewhere else in the city, and it's being funded by different means. So what are they doing with all the money they're sitting on? And this comes to a head in 1995. The reason? Batman. In 1994, Warner Brothers had used an old fire station in Echo Park, and in exchange for using it, they paid a $2,500 donation to Old 23, and they were told that that donation was going to be utilized for building a museum at Engine 23. They additionally donated $5,000 in video equipment and were told it was going to be utilized for the fire museum. When they discovered that, in fact, there was no longer a plan to build a fire museum, that they had paid donation money to a private fund, essentially, that was no longer using the money to build anything, they were incensed and pissed off. And Michael Walbrecht, who is director of studio and production affairs, ended up writing a memo to all of his location managers that ended up being passed along to the city that said these types of donations to the fire department are not governed by city regulation and, under normal circumstances, should not be paid. He further called them, quote unquote, a form of extortion. And ultimately, the anger of studio executives found its way into city politics in Los Angeles, surprise, and triggered an audit of Old 23. There was a giant, huge newspaper coverage on this over the course of 2 issues of the LA Times in 1995, and articles by Robert Lopez. And they are really fascinating to go look at if you can pull them from archives, because they talk about so much of what's going on here. But to distill it down, a total of at least $211,000 in funds were placed into a private account held by Manning and Johnson and never provided to the city treasury. $4,500 of this was for films that never even had permits, and $6,000 of it were for fees that were completely unaccounted for, where nobody knew whether or not the money had ever actually been paid or not. They were just sort of entered into their records. And the actions of Old 23 opened the city up to massive liability. It was once one of the biggest findings here, because no production or business insurance was carried at the site whatsoever. So here was a situation where what you probably should have had was like a $1.5 million insurance policy, because you have studio activity going on, but there was no insurance policy, which would have just left the city open to liability if something had ever happened. And it's probably a blessing that it never did. Fire officials also never had the then 85 years old structure inspected for stability. So despite the earlier 1974 concerns by the Public Works Department, who wanted to tear the building down, the fire officials never bothered to do anything to actually inspect the building for seismic stability or to ensure the foundation was still secure or any of those things. They just went along with what was going on. Public Works moved a guy in 1978 and he was fixing up the building. He was there until he stopped, and then they brought a new guy in to run a film leasing company. So in that situation, all the work stopped to even maintain the building. Needless to say, Manning and Johnson quietly resigned from their positions in 1995 and left the Los Angeles Fire Department. And all the former commissioners who had signed off on this project and created Old 23 had quite a bit to say about how they had no idea that this was going on. They essentially thought that the building had been in control of a neighborhood resource group, and was, even though it was not being utilized for the fire department anymore, that somebody else had been given it in the city, that they were not aware that the fire department had maintained and retained the building. So the fire department's involvement in running the building essentially sunsets around 1995, at the same time as Old 23 is kind of called out and made very clear that they're involved in some pretty financial wonky stuff. So what happens next? Well, this is about when Engine 23's long and ill-fated transition to a youth arts center that still hasn't happened began. In 1996, the building was ultimately placed into the control of the Department of General Services, and they had to figure out what to do with it. There was a 1996 ballot initiative called Proposition K that was a Los Angeles City proposition that would have funded building or rehabilitating youth and recreation facilities throughout the city. So this is supposed to be money that's earmarked for youth recreation or youth arts programs. And a lot of this came out of the notion that, like, in the 90s, they looked at things like city pools and they said, why are all of our pools so lousy and poorly maintained? And they were like, oh, they were built in like the 1950s. That makes sense. So they needed to go out and like kind of rehab a lot of park facilities and things. And this ballot initiative was put out there to do that. Now, a ballot initiative, for those of you who may not be familiar with that, is when there's a potential way to solve a problem and you allow the constituents in your community to directly vote on it. So as opposed to voting for a politician and then you have to like lobby your politician to do what you want, this is a situation where voters sign petitions, and if enough people sign a petition, then the item ends up on the ballot during election season, and then you can vote for or against that thing. And to be fair, when I grew up in New York, there weren't so many ballot initiatives. After moving to California, I learned that California has a rigorous ballot initiative process. The ballot initiative essentially told the city voters in Los Angeles that if they voted for it, $25 million per year would be allocated over the next 30 years to take 180 plus properties, give or take a few, and turn them into improvements. Either take a park that was beat up and fix it up, a basketball court that needed work and correct it. And in this case, Engine 23 was selected and marked as one of the things that should be improved, and it was designated in the ballot initiative when it was put forth to the voters as the future home of a youth arts center. And this is important because we're going to talk about this in a few minutes about why ballot initiatives are hard to change, but this is sort of the moment that Engine 23's fate is sealed for the next 30 years at least because of how this ballot initiative is written. Now, at the same time that Engine 23 is selected and marked as the future home of the Youth Arts Center, Daniel Taylor is still at the firehouse. So he hasn't been moved out, and he's now still paying rent to someone. And to be honest with you, I couldn't figure out who. Who was still taking his rent at this point. But Daniel Taylor remained at the firehouse, and he continued to allow filming to go on there, forming a nonprofit group that he called the Corporation for History, Art, and Culture. And he was also running public events there without insurance or city authorization. So he was running beat poetry events and different situations where he would open up the ground floor of the firehouse and allow people to come in and experience something in the space, whether it was performance art, whether it was something he was having an exhibit, whatever it was. And it was a lot of community-oriented stuff. And if you've ever been on GB Fans and seen the old photos of the inside of the firehouse that are hosted there, then you've probably seen his Honda parked in the ground floor, just people sitting around on couches, because it was treated as an open space. He had a loft on the 3rd floor that he was living in, and downstairs he treated like a studio and a public performance space where people would come in and do beat poetry and stuff. Ultimately, the city had to fight him for a while, and they evicted him by 2010. And the work to redesign, rehabilitate, etc. could finally begin. Now, the first phases of the project were oriented around removing existing tile work, fixtures, etc. Now, a weird thing about Engine 23 is not only was it put onto the city's historic cultural list of properties, but it's actually also on the National Registry of Historic Places. Again, not because of Ghostbusters, but because of its unique architecture and its unique design. It essentially serves as one of the last remaining vestiges of firehouses of that era that were being built and built up. And so essentially, this is a situation where this is a firehouse that's been protected in a way. If you take something out of it, you arguably have to put it back and restore it back to what its original aesthetic was. So part of this work is literally about going in and taking down all the tiles, all the fixtures, all the stuff that makes that building look like what it looks like and gives it the cultural aesthetic that it has. If you don't save it, if you just go in and rip it out, you're not really doing anything. There's no reason to keep the building. Why not just knock it down then? So for years, part of the process was to go in and figure out what needs to be pulled out of the building. Where are you going to take it? Where are you going to warehouse it, etc. Now, what you're looking at is that when you see the firehouse photos that are out on the internet, you're going to notice that there are no tiles, there are no fixtures, there are none of those things because it's all been removed for a seismic stabilization project. The building did in fact need work to be brought up to code. And it needed to have a lot of different seismic additions or improvements made so that way it won't fall down in an earthquake. And so this meant that the first phase of the project was really not even one that talked yet about what specifically is going to be inside as much as just hey, it's going to be a youth arts center and we know we need to go do these things to shore up the building first. And so between 2010 and now, a lot of what went on was that part of the process was going in and fixing up the building to a point where it was stable. Now, Prop K projects, their interior design, their function, their programming, what it's supposed to do for the community is supposed to be discussed with what's called a local volunteer neighborhood oversight committee. Essentially, it's a group of volunteers from the neighborhood, activists, concerned stakeholders, etc., who come forward and want to talk about what this project should do in their community. And every one of the Prop K projects has these opportunities for local volunteer neighborhood oversight committees to engage with city officials about what's going into their community and how they can utilize it and what it's for. Now, this led to public questions from Skid Row residents because when you put in new youth programming in most places in the city, that's treated as, wow, great, more stuff for kids. But the Skid Row residents and activists representing their interests in downtown LA had some pretty serious questions about why a youth arts center was being built in Skid Row when there were so few kids in the area. And activist and fashion pattern maker Catherine McNenny, who I is also runs a nonprofit organization that helps to bring trees and bring greenery into the downtown area, and it's the urban environment, notes in a recent Medium.com article that by 2013, the few remaining non-governmental organizations that served children in Skid Row had closed their doors or moved because of a complete lack of kids to serve. So the question became like, why are they building a youth arts center in the middle of this environment when there's no local kids who are going to use it? And at the same time, you're essentially saying that it has to be a youth arts center. It has to be something that only kids can use. And this raised some serious concerns about gentrification, safety, and ultimately why a cultural resource in Skid Row, meaning the building, because it is a cultural resource that is where it is in that neighborhood, was being made inaccessible to the local community members in favor of serving kids from outside the community, from the rest of the city. And that is a sort of sticking point that began to really come up over and over again between the city and between stakeholders in Skid Row and in downtown who represent those people in Skid Row. And in large part because if you really think about it, there's so few things down there. So the fact that the firehouse was opened up as a safe place to come for performance art and things was like a valuable resource for those people. When it was closed up because the city came back in and threw Daniel Taylor out, they felt they lost a community resource and a performance space and etc. So during a 2018 meeting between representatives of the city and the local volunteer neighborhood oversight committee, the city's lawyers explained in legal, if not well thought or emotionally sensitive language, that the firehouse would have to serve kids because of the nature of a ballot proposition, and that any adult use would have to be quote unquote tangential and quote unquote inconsequential. This is kind of insulting, right? To tell a group of people that like you can use the building as long as your use of the building is inconsequential, meaning that no one cares about it and we don't care about it either. It kind of comes across as demeaning, right? I mean, you live in a community, there's a firehouse in your community, it's a public resource, and you're saying that you can't use it, only kids can use it, and only those kids who don't live here. And by the way, we may let you use it, but only if your use is inconsequential and doesn't really have any consequences or isn't the priority because you're a tangent, right? So this created some frustration, some real genuine frustration between community members, including an activist who has since passed, who went by the name General Jeff. And General Jeff was referred to by Skid Row activist community members as quote unquote the mayor of Skid Row. He was an outspoken activist who would come out and talk about issues, was well known to city officials. And he showed up at this meeting along with other representatives of the Skid Row community and wanted to understand why it is that this was the case, especially because Proposition K also contains language suggesting that its funds could not be used for any project discriminating access based on age. So this is a weird thing, right? Like you have a proposition that says we're going to build a bunch of youth-oriented programming and facilities. We're going to use the taxpayer dollars to do that. And you have to make it for kids. That's who it's for. That's who it has to be for, because that's what we funded. At the same time, that very same ballot propositions, other provisions and other sections of it say that you cannot fund any project that discriminates based on age. So the Skid Row activists and the Skid Row community and the lawyers and folks who represent those groups are sort of, wringing their hands and saying like, how can you say that it's not accessible to us based on age at the same time as you have a policy that says you can't fund it if that's the case? And how do you rectify this problem? Like, how do you rectify the lack of congruity here between a provision in the law that says you have to fund it for kids and predominantly kids, and at the same time, you're going to say that you can't fund it if it denies access based on age? They essentially came into the meeting and suggested that there was an opportunity to build a community center that could have a recording studio and help to facilitate creating media and performance art, etc., from people in the community. And we're told that that was not really a potential possibility. And the rationale for why, according to city lawyers, was that a ballot proposition is sort of set, that you give it to the voters and you say, this is what we're going to do, and you can vote for it or you can vote against it. But once you make that commitment and say to the voters, this is what we're going to do, you can't change it after they agree to it. If you do, you need to put it back up to the voters in order to get them to approve the change. So that would mean taking the entire ballot proposition proposition back to the voters to make modifications to the entire proposition over this one property. So essentially, this is why the policy sits the way it does in terms of why it's supposed to be a youth arts center, is that it was designated as such in 1996 while there were still kids in the Skid Row area, and now there aren't. So why does it make sense to build the youth arts center? Now, for years, that question really didn't get answered. It just was a situation they kept moving forward on because this is what was funded and this is the project. And to be real, it's a 30-year project. Now, that sounds like a long time, except that the project began in 1996 and it's 2022. Right? They didn't really make any work on this. They had to get people out of the building. They had to do a lot of stuff. And it's not like they're working on all 180 of these projects at exactly the same time necessarily. There's $25 million being funded each year towards these projects. So this means, though, that you're now facing a situation where you were almost, you're 4 years out from the 30-year window to finish this project. And we're at this point don't have a clientele that is in the local environment that would benefit from it. And it seems that there may have been some recognition from the city at this point that it is not particularly viable to build a youth arts center in Skid Row in a post-COVID environment where situations have gotten even more drastic regarding homeless populations and people lacking housing and dealing with significant problems in the state of California. We have epically historic housing issues that are going on. And as a result, it means that like Skid Row has gotten even more troubling in the time that we've gone through COVID and a lot of homeless policies and restrictions were put on moratoriums or given amnesty. It's kind of changed the ground and changed the dynamic of what's going on in many of these urban communities that are dealing with large homeless populations, and in particular, Skid Row. So at the same time, a tragic thing happened in that General Jeff passed away. So you have a member of the community activist network who is well appreciated and well liked, who engaged the city about this issue in the past, and he's now gone, which means that for the city to move forward on a project, if they simply don't acknowledge some of what's gone on in the concerns of the city, they're kind of coming across as really rude and tone deaf on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's likely to create a lot of political backlash for them. And as much as you might think I'm doing a little bit of spectral speculation here, Catherine McNenny actually has emails that she's managed to secure from the city that communicate this very fact, that they are concerned about creating that kind of a backlash or coming across as politically tone deaf in terms of what to do next. So they have communicated internally through like the Department of Cultural Affairs at the city that perhaps this is not the right project anymore. And they, in fact, according to Catherine McNenny's Medium.com article, she has evidence of emails and exchanges from PowerPoint presentation slides where they were talking about potential new partners for the firehouse. But nothing's been discussed probably since 2021 about who is going to be in that space or what goes on. What seems to have happened at this point is that we've reached the end of phase 1. The seismic stability has happened. What phase 2 looks like and what goes back in and goes on the walls and happens and how the building gets designed from there may now be up in the air. And at the same time, the project seems to have faced a series of potential budget shortfalls that are happening. And so money is being integrated and injected in via the general fund from the city in order to pay for it. And interestingly enough, interesting sidebar, the last film project to be filmed inside of that building obviously was Ghostbusters Afterlife. And there's actually been a memo that's been turned up by Catherine McNenny and some of the folks who are lawyers working on behalf of Skid Row activists that a payment was provided from Sony to the city, a donation for the restoration project of the firehouse of about $5,000, which their argument, the activists in Skid Row, is kind of hearkening back to those 1995 payments of, is this a form of quid pro quo, where the community members can't actually access the resource that's around them, but Sony was able to utilize the firehouse for filming. And that memo actually says in it that Sony is grateful to have been able to feature the firehouse one final time on screen because of the relationship between Ghostbusters and the Firehouse. So at this point, Sony expects to be done with the Firehouse pretty clearly from the memo they've put out. When you look at what's happening with the Firehouse today, it's important to think about this, that the Firehouse is in a really weird place, and it arguably could serve people in that really weird place if it were open to them. But the way they tried to preserve it was to earmark it alongside youth funding while there's no kids in the area. So what will this look like in the future? I'm not really sure, to be 100% honest with you. What I can tell you is that the Firehouse has a long history, and that history is one that's kind of rife with political strife. It's rife with people trying to make money off of a building. It's historic and it's a community resource. And it's something that I hope to see opened up for community access in some way, even if that's something where they have to redesign and rethink what the plan is and what the project is here. Because while the original Proposition K language sort of suggests that they're supposed to do something for youth, it seems that it's kind of become a situation where it doesn't make a lot of sense to keep doing it. And to be real, like, this is not cheap. This is a building that has probably had about $12 million spent on it so far, and that has an additional proposed funding amount of like another $5.5 million. So when you look at the original like $1.8 million that was spent in terms of inflation, when you look at that $53,000 that's spent on the building to begin with, when they make it, that seemed exorbitant at the time. Now we're talking about probably like $12.5 million that's going to be designated to make this building into something else. And to have gone as far as they have already, having spent a lot of funds on all of the work that they've done to stabilize the building, to get architectural plans, to do all the things that they've done so far. If they don't finish it, it's kind of like taking money that could have been utilized for a lot of other youth programming and throwing it in the trash. So it's not really clear what's going to happen here. It is kind of clear that the Skid Row community wants something from this that's going to help them. And this May 19th, 2020 email from Leslie Thomas that's been discovered by Catherine McNetty and the folks who are trying to get access to the Firehouse is pretty clear that she says in it, we need to discuss this. This is not a good option or a solution to this issue. This no longer needs to take place. Circumstances and conditions have changed and will continue to change for this project. The plans for this project are no longer relevant. Let's try to make a decision that will not result in further personnel and other problems. All right. So at that point, they put out a list of possible partners that was emailed within the Department of Cultural Affairs, like School on Wheels, the Union Rescue Mission, Council District 14, the Skid Row History Museum and Archive, the Skid Row Housing Trust, a variety of others, the Young Musicians Foundation. But at that point, there was no more communication. There was no more follow-up, and it's not really clear what's going to happen. My concern, 100% real. There are 4 years left to go on this plan. There's 4 years left before the Proposition K funding sunsets. Is this running out the clock? Is the city trying to figure out what to do with this building at this point and going, well, if we don't do anything, we can reach a point where maybe we can divest ourselves of it because we didn't finish the project? What's the recourse? I don't really know if there's anything that we as Ghostbusters fans do. And to be honest, I mean, I'll say this. I think that we as Ghostbusters fans don't do anything because this is a community fight. And I mean that not in the sense that like you shouldn't support the community as much as like we don't help necessarily. We don't necessarily bring a lot to the table in terms of our sentimental value or our emotional take on how we feel about a building that is a community resource for people who otherwise can't access it and who are frustrated about it. But I kind of want to suggest to folks that it's worth going and taking a look at Catherine McNetty's Medium.com article on this, because it's really in depth about talking about the background on this issue and what's gone on with this. And there's also some great links to these organizations that are trying to get community access to the Firehouse for the long term. And you can find her article on Catherine McNenny with a K. So KatherineMcNenny.medium.com. And the article is called Ghostbusters Quid Pro Quo, Updated Tales About Skid Row's Infamous Firehouse Number 23. I find it kind of fascinating that where we end up being useful for the folks in that particular struggle is that our videos, our photos, the things that we actually post end up being the things that let the community see what's inside the building in their own backyard. That they're not able to necessarily get access to the building, and the activists, the lawyers, the folks who don't necessarily live in Skid Row but represent the people in that underserved area, they can't get access to the building themselves. So when one of us, one of our members of our fandom end up getting down there and ends up accidentally stumbling into the building and somebody lets him in, it actually is what lets the folks in that area see what the condition of the building is, so that they can figure out, like, is there a way to utilize it, or is there an argument to be made such that we can get this community asset to help us? And, there's a lot of politics to that. And I don't want to come out as sort of saying like, oh, I think we should absolutely take the firehouse and give it to whoever we want to give it to. There's a lot of different problems in Skid Row, and there's a lot of different things that need to be probably considered about how that building could be utilized by people in the environment and keep it safe and secure. But I hope that the city, that the folks who are stakeholders in Skid Row can work together to find a solution to this, and that it doesn't just turn into a project that fails or that is sold off to somebody else who turns it into a private office building or condos or something else that ends up not being a community center. I can't imagine it would be condos in the middle of Skid Row, but there has already been ideas about trying to turn a firehouse like this into a private restaurant. So it could be a number of other things. If it can be something that helps the community, why wouldn't it be? Why shouldn't it be? Especially because it's a firehouse. And that's what every firehouse is. Every firehouse is a place that helps your community. That's why they're so cool. Like, it's why as a kid, you're like, fire trucks are loud. Fire trucks are cool. Also, they have sliding poles. Also, this is a place of help and a place of support. And so I hope this has been a bit of an interesting history lesson and a little bit of even if it's a bit of a minecart of facts and figures. But the firehouse is a place that means a lot to us in our hearts, because it's a place where a lot of our dreams, a lot of our hopes, a lot of our inspirations took place. And for me, I hope that a firehouse can be rebuilt, put back together, and serve to be a good place of hope and inspiration for people in a community, because it's an outstanding cultural resource. It's not just one for us because we care about it as a fandom, or I guess for deep diehard people who are into Big Trouble in Little China or The Mask, but it's a cultural resource that the people of Los Angeles paid for and are paying for again and again, and they're continuing to pay for with their tax dollars. And I would hope that we can see it opened up to benefit everybody who's been helping to try and keep it alive, even if they don't know they are, with the money that they're putting into it. So that being said, usually we don't get very political on this podcast, and I hope I didn't get too political this week, but I hope that the building gets restored back to the point that it was before they took it apart, that we see some of that green and white tile back in the garage, and that in the future, there is some hope and some heroism that can go on in that space again. As a final thing I want to add here, for those of you who've listened this far into this podcast episode and have been thinking, oh my God, they may never put the firehouse back together. How are we ever going to see the Ghostbusters inside ever again? Fear not. The entire interior of that building, as I understand it, has been 3D scanned by Sony, such that they can recreate it wherever they need to. And that's part of why the memo that they wrote, in which they said they were happy to feature it one last time, was probably very true. They expected it to be a youth arts center. They expected it to become something else. And didn't think they'd ever be able to film in there again. And having the Ecto-1 in there for Afterlife, and having Ernie Hudson in there, and having the containment unit in the actual basement there was probably the last time that's ever going to happen. And they probably knew it at the time. So it was really cool that they were able to connect that tissue and bring the firehouse into Afterlife in that after credit sequence. But you're probably never going to be in there again, for real, for the movies. And that's okay. They will reconstruct that set however they need to. If we've learned anything from Afterlife, it's that they can literally build a house outside, take it down, and rebuild it piece by piece inside, and it looks exactly the same. Because that's exactly what they did with with the farmhouse in Canada, and they literally drove it across a border and brought it to the United States to set it up in a soundstage. So I think about this a lot, that the firehouse has a lot of sentimentality to me, and I want that connective tissue of going and touching a wall and having my tactile moment there. But if I never get it, our narrative, our story, our universe is safe. It's the people in that environment who aren't, and who I hope are able to access the community resources that are available to them in the future. Welcome back to the year 2024 and 5 months after Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, where we indeed got to see a new take on the interior of the old firehouse that represented all 3 of its floors. The firehouse interior set that Luke Whitelock designed was an outstanding recreation of many of the iconic locations in the firehouse that we would expect to see. And as I pointed out in the wrap-up on the end of episode 10, they were indeed able to rebuild that firehouse from the plans and scans they had, and you can hear Luke talk a lot about that in his episode a few months back. And of course, that is the idealized version of the firehouse. It is a version that takes its design notes from Engine 23, but then rectifies the incongruities of fitting Engine 23 inside of Hook and Ladder 8 in New York City. And perhaps something to consider is that that's probably from here on out the canon version of the firehouse. It's really unlikely that in the next Ghostbusters movie, an art director is going to come along and decide, hey, you know what we need to do? Redesign the architecture of the inside of the firehouse. I think we've done that. I think that road has been paved, and there's not really a reason to go back and redo it. So that means that version of the firehouse you saw in Frozen Empire is probably the version that exists in canon for every project moving forward. While that's really cool, and Ghostbusters Frozen Empire has come and gone, and its practical firehouse set has been erected and scrapped for well over a year, Engine 23 remains an unfinished project, and it leaves the question, what has been going on in the time while they were making an entire fake firehouse in a different country, filming a movie inside of it, tearing it down, and then coming back and releasing the movie? Well, the reality is that while there was a pause in the work on the firehouse, it has resumed, and there is more going on than we might have known about. In 2023, there wasn't a ton to go on with respect to the state of the Firehouse project until a few weeks before Halloween, when the next reveal of the Firehouse came from none other than the city's engineers. The LA City Bureau of Engineering has its construction division at work at the Firehouse, and they documented their progress on their Facebook page on October 16th of 2023 with 6 photographs detailing the second and third floor spaces, including the front windows and what appeared to be the doorways to part of the barracks space. It also included a stairwell landing and what appeared to be the third floor, and what seemed to be a glimpse of the third floor penthouse parlor area with mahogany moldings, paneling, and built-in bookcases still intact. No real finishing work had been done. In fact, what was really there was just kind of the stuff still in place after the teardown before seismic stability. Along the lines of seismic stability, the downstairs garage bay area was indeed still a mess in these photos, though a much more organized mess. It no longer featured a giant dugout pit in the floor, and instead there was lots of rebar installed as flooring support, presumably waiting for concrete to be poured before a hopeful restoration of the brick flooring. Cross your fingers. A few days after those photos were shared online, a short, less than 2-minute video was posted, again by the Bureau of Engineering, featuring Justin Ramirez, who's a senior civil engineer for the Construction Management Division in the LA Bureau of Engineering. In this short video, Ramirez walks people through sections of the firehouse undergoing active work, including a brief glimpse at what appears to be the second floor area that we all know very well from Ghostbusters and Ghostbusters 2. At one point, he stops on the third floor to note how each of the trim pieces and wood panels were meticulously labeled for removal and eventual replacement, implying that indeed, as a building registered as a National Historic Place, the fixtures, tiles, etc. are all waiting somewhere for some later restoration phase of the project. As for the building's purpose, the BOE reaffirmed that the project was for a youth art center, stating on Facebook, and I quote, "Currently, the Construction Management Division manages the conversion of the historic Engine Company 23 fire station in downtown Los Angeles into a youth art center. The project is planned to be completed in 2 phases. Phase 1 includes seismic rehabilitation, building upgrades to meet current Los Angeles Department of Building and Safety codes, and historic restoration. Phase 2 consists of interior remodeling to convert the building's use into a youth arts center. The new building will contain flexible gallery, exhibit space, and historic apparatus bay, and classrooms for arts programming on the second and third floors. Fun fact, this is where the original Ghostbuster movie was filmed." So, hey, at least they know where they are when they're working inside. That's kind of nice. So that's kind of interesting to consider that they are reaffirming in 2023 that this is in fact a youth arts center and that they are planning the space to have classrooms upstairs and gallery space downstairs where the garage was. But it also raises some questions about, whether or not that is going to meet the needs of the folks in Skid Row. There's been some concern, as I've talked about in episode 10, from Skid Row activists and residents who fear the firehouse won't be accessible to them. And at the lighter end of the scale of impact, they see this as, a mere inconvenience, that they won't be able to access something that exists within their neighborhood. On the heavier end of the scale, there are those who see the firehouse and the sort of plan to bring kids into it who don't live there as an example of downtown gentrification. And so it seemed from the BOE's posts that the intent for the building remained to serve kids in the area, despite the fact that there aren't really any kids around. However, I have to say, happily to report a bit that there has been some negotiating for community access that may make things a little easier in the future once the building is done. You see, while the BOE's construction division have been hard at work on the seismic stability of the building and bringing the structural elements of the building into alignment with safety standards and building codes, so too have the folks down at the Department of Cultural Affairs. Or perhaps a better way to put this is that say they're back on this project and engaging the community. In the wake of General Jeff's passing in 2018 and the tumultuous meetings that happened between the community at that time, the city placed the project on temporary hold, with internal emails eventually being released by Catherine McNenny illustrating that the city had decided to let some cooling off happen. And then COVID hit, changing the dynamics of virtually every city project and an exacerbation as well of an existing crisis of unhoused individuals, both in Skid Row, certainly, but also across the rest of LA. Now, you may recall from episode 10 that there was one individual who worked for the city who had begun to email their colleagues and suggest that perhaps this project was no longer viable, that there should no longer be funds or personnel committed to it as a result of the change in circumstances around the project, and that they suggested that the circumstances would continue to change and thus there should be a reevaluation of why the project was going forward. That person turned out to be Leslie Thomas, who at the time was the community arts director for LA City's Department of Cultural Affairs. He had been working to manage the community engagement and programming for Engine 23 for many years. He had been working for DCA for about 20 years or more, and ultimately, within 2 months of writing that email, chose to retire. Now, whether or not those two things are related, who knows? This could be a situation where he chose to retire because he'd worked there for a really long time and decided to just kind of boldly speak his mind before he retired. It could be a circumstance where it had nothing to do with it, where maybe he retired because COVID happened. Who knows? I don't. I'll be clear about that. I don't know what the motives or intents there were of that email. I just know that he was essentially sending it and saying that this is a project that should not continue to go forward in the way it is. So while work continued on the building in 2023, it's kind of unclear, what they were doing other than resuming what they had been working on before. What we didn't know was that the city was actually re-engaging the community about the project with some new perspectives and faces in place. In June of 2023, the Department of Cultural Affairs hired a new community arts director to replace Leslie Thomas after his over 20 years of service and presiding in many ways over this project. And in doing so, they turned to a fresh face who was not from within the city government and was coming from the outside. Lisa Davis joined the Department of Cultural Affairs at that time, coming from a background in educational program design and direction at museums and public arts institutes. So Davis brought an expertise in public art projects and in education, but also a fresh perspective from outside the nearly 30 years of painful institutional memory surrounding Engine 23. In January of 2024, the Department of Cultural Affairs kicked off a re-engagement with the community regarding Engine 23 by hosting a community art day at the James Wood Community Center on 5th Street in downtown LA. The event was reported on by Skid Row activists Catherine McNenny and Bobby Buck, whose video on YouTube documenting the event was absolutely instrumental to this coverage, so thank you very much to Mr. Buck for putting it out. In the video, you can find over at bobbybuck.tv, Davis introduces the event and explains that its purpose is to, quote, gather community input for our Engine 23 Youth Community Arts Center, and further explains that the goal of the day was to, quote, get inspired by these activities. She further cited her experience as an arts educator and suggested that she likes to use small art projects to get ideas flowing about what people wanted to take place in their community arts center. So materials provided to attendees indicated that the goal was to open this center by the end of 2026, perhaps not coincidentally, coincidentally the same year that the 30-year funding from Proposition K actually sunsets. The attendees of this event range from community members and activists seeking to provide a voice about what could go on at this Youth Arts Center, DCA educators from other sites in LA County demonstrating things like music production and podcasting tools via audio sampling and looping demos, the University of Southern California's Viterbi School of Engineering demonstrating small Arduino-based tech projects that kids could do, representatives from Discovery Cube Children's Science Center demonstrating introductory coding and STEM activities, and Cal Arts educators teaching natural printmaking. And at the same time, there were also a variety of Skid Row community members, artists, media, meaning folks like independent journalists, activists, etc., who would also come out in order to get their voices heard and express what this art center could do for the local community and those within it. Now, this was certainly an interesting opportunity for the Department of Cultural Affairs, for different partner agencies that might work within a youth arts center in the community, and the community members themselves to come together and network and find out a bit about each other's resources, needs, etc. But there was also a notable absence of someone at this event based off of Bobby Buck's video, and that group of people were kids. Moreover, what's somewhat evident from the voices featured in Buck's video is that there's still community members who were coming out to this event to discuss what needs the community has. And DCA employees on camera were talking about reaching youth, while these community members were talking about what's needed for adults. And then a variety of youth-oriented agencies were in attendance who all serve kids in a different context than within Skid Row. So, to be clear, that's my little editorial summary rather than something Buck notes. But it is something evident that throughout this video, everyone featured is excited and motivated by the project, but the speakers on camera all seem to present different perspectives or motives for what they're doing there. Well, perhaps that was a good thing, because a subsequent meeting took place about 6 months later in June of this year between city staff, including Lisa Davis, and the local volunteer neighborhood oversight committee in Skid Row. While I've been unable to find a recording of this meeting, and you can rest assured that I've been looking, I was able to turn up a set of informal minutes that were published by Catherine McNenny via the Skid Row Park Advisory Board Facebook page. And this is a weird thing to consider, is that a lot of what goes on in Skid Row in terms of activism is not necessarily happening through like official city channels, and instead happens through activist networks and Facebook pages that are for things like the parks. In fact, General Jeff, who passed away and was one of the activists in Skid Row, has had Gladys Park renamed after him because of his important work turning the parks within Skid Row into better community resources for the folks who live there. So the parks are sort of a really valuable resource for the folks who are in that area. And a lot of the discussion about what goes on within Skid Row happens to take place within those spaces, talking about parks and Facebook. But I digress. While I could not find a video of this meeting, I was able to find some limited minutes, and those minutes reveal a conversation between Davis, community members, city officials, and guest speakers who have experience attempting to engage communities within Skid Row in the past. While those minutes are limited, one of the key takeaways from the meeting seems to be that Davis made it clear that the previous meetings with the LVNOC going back to 2018 had seriously shifted the city's understanding regarding programming, and that the city now had a better understanding that adult programming within Skid Row was key to the success of this art center. The hope was that though this is a youth arts center and the Proposition K funding remains for a youth arts center, through creative scheduling, intergenerational and family programming, and other creative strategies, there may be ways that the community members could use the facility, and that could take place at times like weekday mornings or evening when the building was not in use for youth programming. This understanding also came not just from those previous conversations dating back to 2018, but also from nearly 75 surveys that were received during that January event. So while the folks came out to that event may have had disparate backgrounds and disparate motives or rationales for what they wanted, it seems that Lisa Davis's little project here to get people together and have an art day actually yielded some good insights from the folks throughout the community. Davis went on to say by the end of the meeting that the goal of the project was to engage the community in a holistic way, including the sidewalk and street spaces around the firehouse, rather than to displace the community in lieu of serving a different clientele or gentrifying them out of the neighborhood. So this is a situation where you have a new voice that comes in and begins to meet with a group of people who have been stakeholders for many years and have sort of ran into the same people in the same situations over and over, I imagine. And then they encounter somebody new who comes in and says, look, we're not really looking to sort of tell you can't use the space. We're looking to find ways to holistically do that together, which has been sort of a different tune that, the city has begun to sing with respect to the building, given that back in 2018, they were essentially saying you can't really use the building in any way that's, meaningful. Any way that you use it has to kind of be inconsequential or tangential. So this shift in the city's understanding of the community's relationship to the Arts Center is arguably a good thing. Right? It's a situation where there's been a lot of resentment and a lot of concern about being able to get back into the building amongst the community members. And in previous conversations, the city has sort of dug their heels in and said, this isn't necessarily going to be for you. And at this point, they're instead saying that, hey, maybe we can find a way that we can all work together so that you can utilize it as well. Now, a subsequent meeting was scheduled for August 19th at the Downtown Women's Center that I regretfully found out about 3 days after it happened, or else I might have tried to attend it. And part of the reason why is because this is potentially the last formal meeting that the LVNOC and the Department of Cultural Affairs will have with respect to this project. No others are actually legally required at this point, and while some informal consultation is likely to continue between the Department of Cultural Affairs and members in the community, there won't necessarily be more meetings, or at least there aren't required to be. There could be, there certainly could be, where they could decide they want to hold more meetings with the community, but there is the potentiality that they could consider this meeting from August as the last one they need to have. While I was unable to attend this meeting, I was able to determine that the goal of it was pretty damn important. It was to discuss the community's input on the interior architecture and aesthetic design and the type of arts programming that the community feels would fit their needs best. And while if I had been there, I would have been rooting for anyone who wanted to advocate for green and white tiles and a brick floor downstairs in terms of the interior design, that second question about what kind of programming comes in is really the far more important one I want to talk about and know the answers to. As I touched on in the original episode, Engine 23 was at one point a gathering place for culture and community art for the residents of Skid Row, even if it was operating illegally. It was a place where music was performed, where spoken word and poetry was expressed by people who lived in the community, and God knows what else went on. But for years, activists in the community have suggested that the firehouse could include a recording studio, or a performance space, or hell, both. And while I have no right to determine what that community thinks would serve its needs best, it would almost be apropos that this embattled firehouse that survived political turmoil, dilapidation, potential embezzlement, all the while serving as a home to nearly 60 different film productions, might find itself as a place for survivors and strivers to learn to use their voices to produce films or podcasts or other media. So, personally, I remain really hopeful to one day stand inside the building and to touch a green and white tile. Although now one that's been reaffixed to the walls in a manner likely to remain in place for another 100 years. But more than anything, I hope we get to see the firehouse become what it's been intended to be more than anything else, a cultural resource for the people in Los Angeles, and hopefully for those in the community where it's been for over a century. When I signed off from episode 10, I was deeply concerned that this project would end up being canceled or somehow die on the vine as it entered a period of financial ambiguity, and indeed, some of my concerns from that version of the episode have been creatively redacted in this updated take. Hooray for the power of editing and remastering! But as I sign off today, I am left more hopeful that fresh perspectives, time to heal from painful discussions, and continued communication between the city and community stakeholders can yield a rebirth of Engine 23 that isn't all that unlike the rebirth of the fictional firehouse in Tribeca, and its return to being an important resource for its community and city following years of neglect, though arguably, bringing Engine 23 back to life could have far greater material stakes for people living in the community around it than the mere joy we were able to experience by seeing our favorite firehouse put back on screens this past March. So where will the firehouse be in another 2 years at the end of the Proposition K funding? We shall see. And when we do, rest assured, I intend to revisit this history of the firehouse one more time, and hopefully, after people are finally able to walk through the doors, instead of linger outside of boarded up doorways in the hopes that people in hard hats will let them sneak a peek. So, that about wraps up this special Firehouse Revisited episode of Extraplasm. As I said at the top of the podcast, Extraplasm will return to its typical format and release date in the first week of September, and then we're going to shoot for a bi-weekly release schedule for September and October. So keep your eyes and ears open for your next set of Ghostbusters headlines and your next awesome guest conversation then. But until then, I need to say thank you as usual to Brendan Pierce of Beducci Studios, who provides our logo and our visual identity for the podcast. And I need to say thank you to Vaporwave artist Magnavox, whose version of Ghostbusters serves as our theme song. And of course, I need to say thank you to you for listening, for tuning in now for almost 100 episodes of the show, and for being a wonderful community of people who have reached out in the last few weeks to say hello and just see how I'm doing, or just to share a funny joke to try and put a smile on my face when things have been rough. I really value what I do with this podcast, and I really value the friendships and the community that it has brought me. So if you've heard me hemming and hawing a bit about how I'm not going to be around as much and over-explaining it, it's largely because I'm afraid that somehow the amazing community that I have built with you all will somehow go away as a result of me needing to dial things down. So if I've over-explained it, if you're sick of hearing about it, you can also let me know that and I'll stop talking about it. But in the meantime, it's always lovely to hear from you all, and you can reach out to me if you have something to share with the podcast at Extraplasm on Instagram, Extraplasm on X, Extraplasm Podcast on Facebook and YouTube, and of course, extraplaspmpodcast@gmail.com if you're really into the whole email thing and you hate social media. And of course, be well, have fun. I hope that things are going well for you as we round out the end of summer and we sort of start into autumn. There's plenty of Halloween madness to ramp up to, and by the time we talk next, Halloween Horror Nights will be well underway, and there'll be things to talk about and reviews to share of it and all kinds of stuff to talk about. So until then, have a great time, have fun, be happy, be healthy, and as Ernie Hudson reminds us every single week,
Try to have fun and always keep on busting. Take care.